Good morning, all, and we'll call the meeting to order. Rather than do the pledge today, I would like all of us to again take a moment of silence for the over 500,000 souls we've lost during this pandemic. Thank you. So I don't see it on the agenda, but I'm assuming we need a roll call. Is that correct?
That would be appropriate, yes.
Okay, Amanda, roll call, please.
Director Sani?
Present.
Director Leffel?
Yes, here.
Director Sabo?
Here.
Director Miller?
Here.
Chair Curcio?
Here. I do not see any members of the public present. Is that correct, Amanda?
Yeah, I don't see any at this point.
Do I want more?
Very good. Okay, let's move on to communications, announcements, and informational items. Anyone from the board have anything for us this morning? Seeing no hands, I'd like to start with the regular agenda items. And Director, item number 1, passenger terminal refinement plan by Kimley Horn. And Executive Director, who should take away on this?
Yes, sir. I'll tee it up and then introduce you to Tom Schnetzer. January of 2020, you received the phase 1 report or phase 1 financial analysis on the safety enhancement program from PFM. And that report was, as you will recall, a little difficult to take. It certainly indicated that there were challenges ahead financially for the airport district moving forward with the master plan process. So on the strength of that, we took a deeper dive into the financial analysis, which then turned into phase 2 of PFM's work. To inform that effort, we also asked our program manager, Kimley Horn, in the person of Tom Schnetzer, to go through a process regarding terminal sizing that really would help us determine what size terminal we really absolutely need to build should we get there. And a little bit of background, the original terminal building in the master plan that we were using as the basis for the phase 1 efforts was just under 100,000 square feet. It was a planning number that was adequate at that time, but certainly was in need of refinement. So the effort that Tom has put forward and that he'll cover with you now is a step toward that complete refinement. It is not the final product, as Tom will tell you. That won't happen until we get to design. But this was an effort to really what I would call right size the terminal building, so we knew what we needed to build based on our traffic forecasts and based on some other information. So with that, I'll introduce to you Tom Schnetzer from Kimley Horn, and he'll walk through, I believe you all have a copy of his work in the board packet. So Tom, if you're there, we'll anxiously await your presentation.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here with you today and provide you with this briefing on the terminal refinement plan. Just a quick background on me. I've been an airport planner for 33 years. Been involved in airport master planning, terminal planning, and terminal programming. I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, I'm an urban planner. So I really am involved in the, setting up the framework for what ultimately needs to be designed, and then making sure that all the appropriate steps along the way, all the boxes are checked before a client hires an architect or an engineer to start with the heavy lifting. But A few just as reference. Within the last couple of years, I've been involved in a very similar study for the Aspen-Pitkin County Airport, which was actually a redevelopment of the entire airport, the runway, taxiway system, new terminal building, new general aviation area. And we're still working on that one, but we had very robust discussions about right sizing their terminal as well. And I may use that a reference once or twice because it has some similar characteristics as Monterey in terms of being a resort environment and having a certain clientele that is not the same as every airport in the country. I've also been involved in the new Terminal 1 redevelopment for San Diego. I led the master plan for that and was also involved in the program definition. That is being designed right now. So that's exciting. And I've done similar work for Houston on 2 of their terminals. They have 7-unit terminals and pretty big variety of airports from Sun Valley to Newark. So I feel like I've seen a lot of things and also very closely tied to the industry and a lot of the trends that are happening, especially what's happening in Europe and Asia. I'm very tied in with the folks doing work out there. I've presented at Passenger Terminal Expo, which is in Europe, on trends, and I'd like to bring a lot of those to the United States clients that we have. Just as a general note, my observation is the kind of things that are being adopted in Europe and Asia, America tends to adapt those maybe 5 years later. US airports tend to be a little more conservative. They want to see something proven. And so they tend to look at Europe and Asia to see what's happening. So you'll see a few references in my kind of towards the close of the presentation about how those trends weigh into what we're doing. This is probably the time when I should share my screen and run through the presentation. So I'm going to attempt to do that right now. All right, can you all see the presentation? That's not up on your computer yet?
No.
That's because I have to hit the share button first.
There we go.
You'd think after all these meetings, we would have it nailed. Okay, so when we first talked to Mike and Chris and Dan about your situation with the terminal, it was very clear that what you were looking for was a refinement primarily focused on right sizing the facility based on what's really needed. You have a master plan that kind of set the stage for this. It determined that the existing terminal building is a bit problematic from a safety standpoint relative to the airfield. So you could do some things to renovate it and pull it back away, but very complicated. Your master plan looked through all those things, and it looked at a new site for a terminal so that the apron and the taxiway alpha can meet all the FAA standards. It did what master plans typically do. It did a really broad swath of a sizing of a terminal based on the data that was available at the time, and also the standards and trends in terminal planning that was in play at that time. Just as a reference, the FAA published a new advisory circular just a couple of years ago, and that was after the master plan work was really done. So they established a size of about 100,000 square feet, which I believe was done in part to protect an area of the maximum that would be needed. So it was kind of a conservative way to plan for the future. So we're at the stage now of taking a much deeper dive into it. And so we looked at a lot of different reference materials. I mentioned the FAA's advisory circular, the International Air Transport Association, their airport development reference manual is commonly used at US airports that are doing terminal programs, at least for certain functional components. So that was a reference that we used. There was also, with regard to security, TSA held a design symposium just a few months ago. So we have some really fresh information from that. Of course, in certain areas, we consult the building code, in this case, California, which has been adopted by your organization. And then just coincidentally, as we were wrapping up this quick exercise, I participated in a 4-day conference that was a global conference that listened to a lot of airport leaders, owners, architects from around the world talk about trends. A lot of it, as you can imagine, is based on COVID and what's different about that, but it's really just about how technology is changing the way the passenger experience is going to unfold in the future. So to sort of bookend the overall process, once you get through and determine that you feel like you're close to what the right size is, and you've conducted your financial feasibility initial analysis to see what affordability looks like, it's really common to do a program definition. That's what most airports do. You get a lot tighter on the pricing, because at this level, we are still building in very generous contingencies for the unknown. Because as Mike said, nothing's been designed yet. There's a general sense of the site of where the new building would go, but there are no floor plans developed yet either. So it's at a really rough part of sizing. And when you get to a more conceptual design, which is like maybe a 10% design, maybe a little bit more, you start to make some decisions about major cost items like structural, building systems, even roofing systems, which can be expensive. And you tighten the costs and you reduce some of the contingencies that we're holding in the cost estimates because things are just not fully defined yet. All right, in terms of the process that we went through, I think I've covered half of this. We're really informing the cost. There were previous cost estimates prepared. The revised cost estimates are really just a proportional. We didn't have a separate cost estimator do another look at it. We were just really looking at sizing and rough proportions. We did some checks with other terminal programs going on in the country. We work with several cost estimators that are involved in almost every terminal program going on. So we've got a pretty good database to check against, cost per square foot kind of figures. One of the things that we did, which really starts to inform more closely the sizing, is we looked at your airline schedules. Terminal planning is done looking at, to some degree, peak activity. The busiest times of the day, your building and your operation have to be able to accommodate the flow of passengers through the building, process them, get them on the plane, get them off the plane. And so we developed what we call design day flight schedules to look at that peak demand. And we look at, how often does that peak happen during the day? And, is it a one-time event, or do you have multiple peaks throughout the day? And as you probably all know, the airlines dictate their schedules. Although I will say that we've been having discussions with airlines about flexibility with timing of certain flights. We look at, you've got a morning push, which we'll talk about, that is connecting people to other hubs. That's probably not going to ever change, but there may be some flexibility which allows you to process more people with less space and less terminal. And then finally, we're looking at a lot of trends in the business, seeing what's happening, especially in the realm of technology and the processing that passengers are doing before they even get to the airport that does not require distinct square footage. Some further notes on the methodology. The pandemic has rocked every airport and brought passenger counts down. We study this very carefully in terms of how different groups are looking at it. Rating agencies and bond houses are two of the main barometers that we use because they have an awful lot at stake when they float bonds for airport projects. And the FAA has put out guidance on when they think there's going to be a return to 2019 levels. We're just going to say that 2024, 25 seems to be kind of a sweet spot that we're seeing. Some airports will see that return sooner. Some will take longer. It all depends on the circumstance. Because it's really difficult to just do a straight line projection in the future, because the trends are a little muddled right now, we've had discussions with the FAA, who has put out some interim guidance on forecasting, and they're big advocates of looking at future scenarios. This is something I've done in the past for quite a few airports. We did this a few years ago for Newark, New Jersey's airport. Did this a long time ago for Miami, looking at a 50-year time frame where nobody can predict the future, but you look at the future maybe playing out in different ways, and you try to, factor all that into your planning. So we did some scenario planning on this one, but we also related it back to your master plan forecast, and I'll explain what that means. For terminal planning, especially if you are looking for FAA money, this is a requirement that what you're planning for is opening day plus 10 years. And that basically means that on opening day, you have enough capacity for a little while. You don't have to start another construction or expansion program in a few years. So that's a kind of a hard rule. And we use that when we analyze demand levels. So date of beneficial occupancy, DBO plus 10 years is the milestone we're looking at. And we just sort of, generally put that at the year 2035 based on a 2025 new terminal. And I understand that your terminal may not be open in 25. If a lot of money becomes available, it could happen sooner, although you have a lot of enabling projects, it might be 26. But we're using that as a reference point. The design day flight schedule is, it's really a look at every flight during every hour of an average day in the peak month, or a typical day in a peak month. And in terms of scenarios, we looked at what we call a modest growth and an aggressive growth. Now to get at these design day flight schedules, this is part science, part art. The art part is that, we talk about what's happening with the airlines, and you have a director who's pretty tied in, pretty savvy about what's happening with the various players in the airline world, how they view Monterey, what the potential new service would be, some of which would be bringing back service that dropped off, some of which would be new routes. So we had extensive discussions about that. And one of my jobs is to make sure that the kind of assumptions we make fall into some semblance of reasonableness, that we're not being, overly optimistic. So, but again, I think having a couple of different scenarios was a good way to treat that because they have different terminal sizing results, which we'll get to, which you've seen in this document. This is what your flights look like in 2019 on a typical day in July. I'm gonna break from my presentation mode here so I can zoom in a little bit. Other way. This is just listing, every flight that happens. These are all departures here. So, operations are either enplanements or deplanements, arrivals or departures. For sake of simplicity, we talk about enplanements or departures. Certain things like bag claim rely on deplanements, people coming off the airplane, but those numbers are generally equal. So this is a really data-rich slide, and if you have a printout of it, I apologize that some of this this stuff on the bottom is gonna seem really small. But I'll just direct you to certain things that we look at. We look at clusters of activity. You've got your morning push, this is what actually happened in 2019 in your morning push. You have kind of a midday and then some evening activity and some things in between. In the future, we looked at modest growth scenario and we added some flights in. We looked at, you could almost characterize these as representative. If these aren't the exact flights that that are in your marketplace in 2035, I hope you're not too critical of what we're doing right now. But we looked at the preponderance of possible flights, and we try to determine, you know, what amount of them may happen during that peak, which is really important. And that relates to what airline we're talking about and where they're going. And so, you know, we put a few extra flights in there. We're looking at you know, Alaska Airlines, for example, which seems like it has great potential there, and adding flights in the midday. Really, not a whole lot of change in your morning push. You've got an evening push that's getting a little bit stronger, and looking at the so in the peak hour, there's a table here a couple of slides from now that compare all these. So this will be a little kludgy, but 272 passengers in a peak hour boarding a plane, and then in the future 304. That's pretty modest growth. And again, that's just the peak hour. That is the peak period that you design for, because you don't want the facilities to break down. You want to make sure that you're providing a level of service to your customers that they expect. Now I'll look at the aggressive scenario, aggressive growth. This is 444 passengers boarding planes. That's a bit more of a jump, and you're seeing, you know, we're dropping more flights here into the morning, midday, and evening. We've got Allegiant in here. We've got American. There's really a variety of flights. We're making some assumptions about additional East Coast feed to places like Chicago. And so those are going to be the early morning flights that need to connect with a hub to make their way east. That's the typical pattern. There's nothing that tells us that that's going to be vastly different in the future. And I will say of the potential air service improvements that you could see, this is a small part of what could happen. We don't think that all the airline routes and city pairs you're chasing are going to happen. I think that's too optimistic. But we do believe that because you're a location that has a higher yield than most airports, the airlines can extract higher fares coming into your market. That gives them an incentive to make sure you got the right feed in there. We also know that, you know, time will tell if this is a permanent trend, but there is movement of people from larger cities to other more desirable places to go. So, you know, like folks in the Bay Area that may be doing work there that are now working from home. We know that there is a bit of a movement of people that have decided to have a place in locations like Monterey, and so your base of potential O&D travelers is growing, and it's not just the normal population growth. It's people that are going to a location like yours because it's special, and they can afford to be there, and they can do their business from their home. And so you're going to get a little bit more of that. So you're always going to have the leisure traveler, you're a resort destination, but we also think that there's going to be a business component to it that is going to continue in the future. This is the summary of what was in 2019. We didn't show you the flight schedule for 2020, but you can see the number of employments here and how that changes on a daily basis. So going from 680, oops, sorry about that, jumping ahead a little bit. Going from, just under 700 in a day to 1,100 in the modest scenario. Using some really rough cowboy math, we tried to equate that to an annual number, and the modest growth scenario is taking you from 233,000 employments to just under 400. Again, this is the year 2035. This is a long range thing. This is a little bit more aggressive than your master plan forecast. The aggressive scenario is quite a bit more aggressive than your master plan forecast. But as anybody that's been in this business for a while knows, it's really all about airlines putting seats in the market. Mike knows this very well, and the airlines they've had to adapt very quickly to the change in demand. And there are airports that are going to not come out well because of it. And there are airports that are going to see some good growth. The yield factor, the profit that an airline makes on a route, you're well above average for them. So that puts you on a different part of their radar. So we don't look at these annual numbers when we're planning for terminals. They're just not granular enough. But we did this as really just a back check to see, if you get the kind of flights that we're putting in the future flight schedules, what does that roughly translate to? So it's just a little reference point. Any questions at this point? And by the way, you can stop me at any time if you have questions about anything or want me to explain something. I'm happy to do that.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead. I can't see the faces right now.
Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. Tom, I've got a question, and it involves the air taxis. Because we've got Joby sitting here in our backyard, and I saw they're just going out for a $4.4 billion money play. They're about a year ahead of all the competition, so we know that they're going to take the market, and they're working aggressively with our military here in our region. How are they going to impact a terminal like ours? So let's just say we've got a lot of CEOs and CFOs from the Bay Area that chose to work out of their homes in our region. But if they want to get up to the Bay Area quickly, do we plan a terminal like ours with the kind of business model that we have to be able to take care of something? Because that's coming, and it's coming quicker than any of us know.
I need a little clarification on the first part that you said. I thought you mentioned a company that is investing. I want to make sure I understand the reference.
Joby Air is right now they're leading the industry. They have the only air taxi that's been flying for an hour at a time without problems, and they're doing most of those test flights in Monterey County. So we know that they're here. Their manufacturing facility is at the Marina Airport, which is our neighbor. And fortunately, I mean, we've been with them early on. I started with them 3 years ago doing some work with them. So I know that Dubai wants 80 of their vehicles, LA wants 100. They're going to go with the big cities, but also a market of what you're talking about, which is our market, with people with a little more money who can afford to not get in a car to go to work for the day or for meetings. How does that impact us?
That's a really good question. And there's a lot of discussion in the industry about it. In this conference I was participating in January, a lot of talk about urban air mobility and where that's going. There's, in addition to Joby, there's 150 different manufacturers developing these airplanes, and there are demonstration projects being planned in Paris and in Singapore. There's Lilium, which is a German manufacturer, is looking at Florida really hard. There's no business model that's been developed for this yet. So nobody really knows how it's going to work. What's fascinating about it is it's obviously a very green technology. Moving people with electric air vehicles is really interesting. It'll be a long time before it's being done for long distances, but you can imagine with battery technology, which is advancing quickly and will continue to advance quickly. My goodness, our current administration is huge on electrification because of the environmental benefits. But here's my view on it. They're not going to be operating out of your terminal. There's going to be a separate facility. These, I can send you, I can probably pull up some graphics here if we have a few time at the end to show you what these things look like. These are small modular buildings that can be set up in a parking lot anywhere. That will, because you're talking about carrying 2, 3, 4 passengers at a time max. And so these are very small, compact facilities. They can happen at an airport, but you would not be processing people through your passenger terminal. It's going to be a separate kind of a thing, and it has a very small footprint. I'm not saying that it couldn't operate out of your airfield, but it's one of the things that they're going to try to sell is the convenience of going through a very, very compact processing thing. Go from where you park your car to where that vehicle is, that air mobility vehicle. That might be 50 feet from your car to, jumping in that air taxi. So yeah, there's a lot of speculation about what it's going to look like, where it's going to be placed. And I think you're going to see in cities where this is popular, you'll see these little pods popping up all over the place. And there's a firm out of London that's designing these, and they're partnered with Airbus to develop these for the 2024 Olympics in Paris. And these are like, they kind of look like the sea containers, modular units that you can pick up and move or reconfigure if you need to make the facility larger. So it's an industry that is in its infancy. I agree with you, it will be moving quickly. There is no business model for it that's been developed yet, but you will have a segment of the population. It's not going to be your everyday flyer that generally walks through your terminal building and jumps on a CRJ to go to a hub. But some of the traffic that's going, say, the Bay Area, I can absolutely see them using something like that.
So I guess what I'm just saying is, will it detract from our passenger load? Because we realize they'll probably be associated with our FBO because they need a big battery storage. They need to have charging space. It's not just a small space. I've looked at their drawings for 3 years. I see what they need. They're looking at the tops of Home Depots and things like that in the big cities that they could land on the roof and do that. But battery storage is a huge piece. I just didn't know if it would impact us in your modeling at all, because I didn't see it in any of your material. And I do think it's the future. It's how people are going to move around from Monterey to San Jose or Monterey to the Bay Area.
Yeah, I agree. I think for short distances, I think it will take people out of their cars and put them in that air mobility environment. I don't think it's going to be cheap for people to do that because they're only moving a few people at a time. So I don't have any great empirical evidence to say how it's actually going to impact the industry. It's sort of like, you know, the industry is still trying to figure out how the transportation network companies, Uber, Lyft, are affecting parking and taxi services because it changes over time and in different locations. But it could bleed off some of your traffic that would normally hop on a small jet going to the Bay Area. But I think at the same time, it's also going to take people that would have made that drive, and whether it's for the novelty of it or the speed or the convenience, they'll just do that instead of making the drive. So I don't have a great answer for you on that, but that's why we look at scenarios. When we say we're looking at scenarios, we're not saying we know exactly what the future is going to look like. We define it in different ways, and we try to plan for all of that, and then bring it back to what are you going to invest money in now?
Well, for me, I see it as just another competitor to take people to San Jose primarily to catch a flight, if they can afford to have a 10-minute ride in an air taxi to get up there to catch a plane. So I think it's something we have to keep our eye on because it may impact our total numbers. We're all middle class, all of us on the board. So will we be taking Joby Air every time we want to go someplace? No, but there are many people in our community who can afford that, and probably will afford that. So, and the fact that it's in our own backyard, we're not sitting in some city that never heard of this type of facility. It's here. It's a Santa Cruz company.
Well, just to back up a little bit on the whole process that you're embarking on, you're still at a pretty early stage. You've done a master plan that identified the issue with the terminal. We've done this refinement, which is helping you get a little tighter. It's going to be a few years before you actually design the building and start breaking ground on it. You've got a lot of enabling projects to do to even prepare for that. As that time goes on, you'll continue to monitor what's happening in that space. And in the next year or two, I think there might be more clarity on where that's going. So it's an absolutely fascinating thing. It sort of aligns with what the major car manufacturers are saying when they're going to go full electric. So I think it's very exciting. I don't think though, for heavy lift, for moving large groups of people economically, it's going to fundamentally change the airline business. I see it as a supplement.
I sat in on the webinar that British company had in January. It was actually during the SWAE conference, and I decided not to do SWAE because I did the conference in London. And it was really pretty fascinating of how they're promoting the design of some of these things and the use of them. So I just think it's something we have to keep our eye on and not pay any attention to, because our numbers are not that big. If somebody stripped away 10% of our riders every year because they're going every 15 minutes out of the FBO to San Jose, that impacts us.
Yeah. And so another way to look at that is, and this was a major conversation when we were going through the Aspen project and talking to the community at length about this, and they were very concerned about it. And they brought up, electric aircraft quite a bit, and what it might mean. They're in a different situation, although, Denver might be a good jaunt for them. But we talked about how the terminal can be done in phases. You may not build everything that you need right away. Although again, if you want FAA money, they require that you build a certain amount of space in there. But as you'll see from the square footage requirements, the difference in accommodating 400,000 and 540,000 employments, it's not huge. When you have certain core functions that are set up, security screening, for example, that can handle a wide range of total annual employments. It can only process so many in a peak hour, but technology might be able to allow you to do more in the future with the same amount of space. That's where, when I'll get to the actual sizing, we look at how we're building in technology. But I don't know that there's anybody that really knows how the air mobility, if that's going to bleed off traditional airline passengers or be a supplement and an air taxi for people that don't want to drive their car a certain distance. And I know you've got people that are going by air now to those markets. So yeah, this could be a replacement.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Sabo?
Mr. Chairman, I have my hand up. Okay.
Yes, I just called on you, Bill. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Your credentials are terrific. And so thank you for that. I'm very interested in your forecast, and I understand your primary function here is not necessarily forecasting, but the forecasts do lead to the work that PFM did, and the forecasts have major consequences in terms of our financing and total costs. The question that I have is why you have an aggressive future scenario and a modest future scenario. Why is there not a third future scenario that is a minimal growth? Because obviously there are financial consequences with minimal growth, and I think our master plan was based upon a 2% growth, and we're at 150% growth on the model. Can you help me with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's different ways to handle that. We could certainly create another scenario and run numbers for that. The other way to handle it, and I apologize if I'm stepping on anything that PFM is doing, but on the financial side, where you want to be more conservative, sensitivity analysis. How does your program look if the passenger count and the revenue coming from those passengers is less than what is projected? I think that's one way to look at it at this stage. On the question of forecasting, it's really difficult, especially when you're trying to get something funded by the FAA, to rely on long-range forecasts. They have guidance out that is not published, although the headquarters has screen shared with me, and I've been able to read key sections of it. But what I can tell you is that when they're looking to actually fund things, they want to know what is happening with traffic the last couple of months. They want to see monthly statistics of recent history. So it's really it's kind of an awkward time right now to try to prepare forecasts in the traditional way. You have forecasts that were prepared in your master plan that I think the baseline year was 2013. So, you could argue that they could get looked at again. Although I will say that through 2019, you were tracking really tight to those forecasts. So those forecasts looked like they were very prescient and did a good job predicting what was happening there. And, we could do a scenario that calculates the square footage requirements at a lower number. Be happy to do that. Or you can look at it from a funding standpoint. How does revenue change with concessions and PFCs and rental car revenues, all the different things, that you rely on as you part of your revenue stream if it turns out to be less than what you thought.
Okay, thank you. That was a good answer. The reason I brought it up is that I think PFM used your data of aggressive and modest forecast for their costing and all that. So your estimates of size of terminal requirements in space are important. And I, as one director, would like to know what the less than modest forecast might be, because it has significant consequences from a financial standpoint of the airport if we proceed forward on this. Thank you.
Yeah.
And maybe if it's all right, I might just chime in there. As I think is a lot of airports do, there's a slightly different approach that is taken when looking at forecasts for capital development and when looking at forecasts for financial planning purposes. And as Tom mentioned, especially in this current environment, airports and their consultants are generally looking more toward scenarios than to a set forecast saying, this is what the future will look like. And I think from a capital development standpoint, it's often more along the lines of what Kimley Horn is presenting here, aggressive to modest. And from a financial standpoint, it's more, low to kind of worst case scenario type forecasting. In this case, we did not use these forecasts for financial modeling purposes. We used them we only used them to determine the size of the terminal and the relative cost of the terminal. So essentially, what Tom and his folks are kind of building up to here. The embedded enplanement, and I hesitate to use the word forecast because it's an assumption that we used is more conservative than that. And we don't have a slide in the presentation, but, could provide something but we did not get up to these levels for enplanement growth in that year. We made assumptions around the period of recovery, which is around the same, kind of getting back to where you were in around 2024, but then much more modest growth thereafter, even than what's shown here. And again, I think that approach is one of, you want to ensure that you design a facility that can meet your needs, but that you can afford something that may be, if you don't kind of reach those more aggressive passenger levels.
Well, thank you, Brian. I guess that's a good answer. What I was concerned about here was from the Kimley Horn standpoint, their space requirements were kind of based on employments as best I understand, or maybe I'm not quite getting it here, but that was the question as to whether or not the employment requirement going forward will require X square feet of space, and that certainly affects cost. So that's the reason I asked the question.
Mm-hmm.
So, excuse me, Tom, before we proceed, this is Chair Curcio. I would like to suggest that we hold questions until we finish one segment at a time. In other words, the segment we're on right now is a 17-page slide presentation. And what I think would be helpful is if our directors could hold questions until we finish this portion of the presentation, take questions on it before we move on to the second piece. Tom, does that make any sense?
Absolutely fine. However y'all want to do that, I'm good with it.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and proceed?
Yeah, I will say that just listening to Brian, so your financial consultant is approaching this in a very conservative way, which is what you want. And so And we do the same thing. We look at facilities more on an optimistic side, and we look at the money on more of a pessimistic side. That way, if things turn out better, then everything improves. It's the reason why we build a lot of contingencies into the cost at this point, because we don't know everything. We don't know if you're going to hire Frank Gehry to design something interesting and expensive. But so we put contingencies in for that. All right, I'm going to continue on. We're getting into the space planning part of it now. I will say that there are some functional components of the terminal that are based directly on enplanements, others that are based on other things. So I'll try to differentiate that. The International Air Transport Association in their development reference manual has this guidance on level of service. Every airport I have worked on for a terminal is right here in the middle with optimum, which means you have sufficient space, comfortable environment. It's not too crowded, it's not uncomfortable, and it's also not excessive. So this is, they updated this a few years ago. It used to be like automobile traffic, A, B, C, D, F, and C was what you shot for. Now it's called optimum. So that's what we used. This is the space program. I'm not gonna go through every line of it unless you want me to. What I'd like to do is highlight some of the key things and maybe make comparisons to what you have right now and maybe explain a few things. This circulation component, which is a big square footage number, is something that it's really just a percentage of all the other square footages that total up before you get to that. And then you add 15%. For this stage, it's a rough approximation. Depending on how your terminal building is designed, that percentage could be less than that if it's designed really efficiently and flexibly, which is the way things are going. I rarely see it go a lot more than that. So anyway, that's just a straight calculation based on the accumulation of all these other things. The ticket lobby queue, this is, so you've got, this is the size that you have right now. And with a lot of other terminals, we're making that smaller because of automation and people, getting their boarding passes either on their phone, or some people still print it out at home before they get to the airport. And if you're not checking luggage, you don't need much. You're not going to be in that queue. You've taken care of all that stuff before you get there. But like some other resort airports and also older populations, we see a continuation of a little bit more personalized service. So where airlines are reducing staffing in general at airports and relying on automation, you will see some of that, but you'll also have more hand-holding than the average airport. That's just an assumption that we're making. So we're not downsizing that. We're recognizing that even at a larger, passenger count, there are some efficiencies that technology will bring, but it's not going to bring it down that much. The hold rooms. In the notes section, this is IATA guidance. There's different square footages for standing and sitting. We defaulted to the California code, which is really similar to a lot of other cities and counties where airports reside. It doesn't vary a whole lot. And it's sort of a mixture. When you have an architect that's going to design this thing, they'll actually calculate the percentage of people standing and the percentage of people sitting down. We didn't do that. We defaulted to the minimum that you need. You can make this larger. In the case of a place like Aspen, we made it larger because they have a lot of flight cancellations because of weather. And so we would see planes stack up and more people hanging around the secure area. It's what's technically referred to as an irregular operation. In Aspen, it was very regular. So we built it into the square footage. You don't have that same concern here. So we went straight off of that. Your bag claim device, this is code, but we back checked it against, what kind of general space you need for having multiple conveyors and how those are laid out. There are some emerging technologies that, baggage on demand that, really only showing up in a few places so far. Very expensive systems where you can use your phone to call up your luggage when you're there so that it's just not going around the bag claim device. That results in less square footage needed in that hall, but you just sort of replace that with a lot more mechanical behind the scenes space that's dealing with that luggage and arranging it for when people come out. It's an automated system, kind of like a vending machine. So overall, if you went with a fancy system like that, your overall square footage wouldn't be different. You just have more behind the scenes. Restrooms. This is something that there's been new. Sorry again. There's been a lot of movement on the restroom scene. They're really becoming very sophisticated. They're becoming more spacious, more customer friendly. When airports do passenger surveys, I don't know if you've done any recently, but it usually ends up being the number one thing they care for is the quality of the restrooms. So we basically planned for what I would refer to as, a current emerging standard, which is a very high standard. And that also involves family restrooms, and that also involves, special needs. So it really covers the full gamut. So that's a pretty big jump from what you have right now. And we don't think that there's a huge difference in the two scenarios, modest or aggressive. We talked to architects about it, and there are certain things when you're within a bandwidth of demand, there's not a lot of variation in facility needs. So not everything is directly proportional in size. There are some things we say, yep, this will be able to serve 1,000 passengers or 1,500 passengers just fine. The security screening checkpoint. This is something that I took some cues from this design symposium that occurred in December, and at the very back of I might as well just jump real quick to some imagery and point out where that's going. These are some emerging systems. You can see this tunnel kind of thing, which is very space efficient, that allows you to move through. The trend in passenger movement is really going to be biometrics and people giving up some of their profile and allowing public agencies to use facial recognition or iris scanning as a way to recognize them. Not everybody's going to do that, so you're still going to have traditional bag belts and traditional screening things. But what we looked at was this is actually a typical dimension. This is directly from that symposium that is the typical layout of the future. And this includes all their offices. Right now, TSA at your airport, they're kind of squeezed with offices elsewhere, but the checkpoint of the future, ideally, they'd be co-located with it. And so this is showing 3 lanes, but this could easily be 2 lanes in a tunnel. So that was our reference point on that. And you can see the square footage. We feel pretty comfortable that, so this 6,000 square feet that's for a 2-lane plus offices. The 7,000 is for an additional lane. And that was something that Mike thought was important for us to include, especially as you consider, differentiating your customers, with like a exclusive pre-check lane for the future. So I would say this is one area where This is a pretty robust piece of square footage. When you get down to actually designing it, you know, you might be able to find ways to make that smaller or find other places for offices, but these are conservative numbers. Since not all of the offices are accounted for here, there are still going to be some additional offices for TSA elsewhere. TSA bag check. This is the point where, through our interviews with your tenants, Dan and I spent a lot of time walking around, talking to the people working in your terminal, getting a sense for how current amount of space works. And this is a real common way to customize the space program. And so we bumped it up based on how they're using existing space. It's tight now, and we characterized it as, you know, with future loads, you know, how much more space would you need? And again, this is within a bandwidth where you wouldn't need more than that unless, you know, you were at 1 million enplanements a year. Then you make the next jump to having more staff. The ticketing, again, you can see that you have some inefficiencies in your current layout. There's some space there that's not the most functionally efficient, and through a combination of increased automation and the way floor plans are being laid out right now, we think you can get away with less square footage. The next few are these, you know, baggage screening. This is the back of the house stuff, and this varies by airport. There's no pat formula for how this works. A lot of it has to do with the workforce, how they work, and, you know, in your case, you have some special things like large pieces of luggage, golf clubs, things like that they have to deal with. So we always custom tailor that to the location. And so you can see the bumps here that we've made using the existing space as the basis, and then adjusting to what amount of space would make this more efficient and, frankly, a better working environment for the people running the operation. That's where those numbers came from. This is, if you lose your luggage, we got some input from the airlines, but we also baked in some industry guidance on that. Retail, food and beverage. This is one where there's no set industry guidance on it. It really comes down to, you know, what has worked for you. You have a pretty nice, good sized sit down restaurant in your terminal. And, you know, I think you have some decisions to make about whether you want to continue something like that in the future. We factored into the space that there, and this was based on discussions with your staff and leadership about possibly continuing that outdoor environment as a portion of it. But this is also recognizing that in the concessions world, things were changing. San Francisco Terminal 2 set a new way to extract more revenue from the average passenger by placing the concessions in a different way. So instead of having a concourse with a corridor and shops along the side, the concessions are, you know, you have to walk through it. It might irritate some passengers, but it has been proven to increase your spending per passenger significantly, and require less square footage. Rental car, this is pretty much just straightforward. I don't know if there's going to be 5 rental car companies in the year 2035. There probably will be. There's 3 major ones and then a few outliers. So we just have space inside for 5 of them. This is a function that could happen outside the terminal. So I've got some notes, you know, in the bottom. I don't think I noted that one, but there are some airports where they just direct you to the parking lot, and that's where you pick up your keys and check in and go. Administrative offices, we have put together a very detailed program on that. and which is not in this presentation, but office by office, baking in some possible changes in staffing, but nothing really a whole lot different, and using industry office sizing for that. So really typical. Your conference room, which my suggestion is normally if it's only used for board meetings and airport functions, it's not eligible for FAA funding. But if you set it up so that it's also can be a community room, that can change the eligibility of it for FAA funding. And we just went with a size that seemed like, based on the kind of crowds you got in there pre-COVID or what you were using it for, seemed like a 20 by 40 size was pretty good. This last one was a really tricky one, and we couldn't really do it for your airport because to look at all of those things, the structural and things like that, a lot of it has to do with the floor plan and the layout. And I just really reached out to a reference airport that was, I would call it a peer airport of yours, where I had access to floor plans and was able to determine on a pro rata basis about the sizing of that. And you can see that it's significantly smaller. And again, we're making a huge assumption here, but I don't think it's a stretch that whoever designs your terminal is going to be using modern techniques and building in flexibility, open floor plan, and making that part of it a lot more efficient. I mean, the fact is your existing building isn't a single building. It's several that were added on, and there's a lot of inefficiencies in that, especially with things like structural. So that will gain some efficiencies in the future. So the bottom line is, this is kind of the range of square footage you're looking at for this range of activity. And I believe that this is a really good starting point for looking at pricing at the stage that you're at. You could easily say, well, let's put the airport admin offices somewhere else, and you could pull 4,700 square feet out of there and do it somewhere else. Mike and his staff and I have talked about that, and it's noted in here. So, you've got some choices to make on the sizing, but, I feel pretty comfortable that as far as right sizing this based on more granular information that we have, building in a lot of trends in the industry, that this is what you should be looking at. I see now I did have all the details for the office space, so I had forgotten that I had put that in there. Any questions on any of those components?
Mr. Chairman, are we holding questions till the total end of this presentation?
Whatever your pleasure is. I actually do have a couple of questions on what we just went over, Tom. The first thing that comes to my mind is our restaurant in this airport is very, very different than the restaurants in the airports in San Jose and San Francisco. Our restaurant in this terminal has actually been a gathering spot for the local community that do really come, that are not traveling, and it's been a big piece of the business there in the past. The other concern I have about reducing the space is we want to have a quality restaurant operator operating that facility, and I question whether the right thing is to reduce the space. Again, even though we all know that outdoor seating has become tremendously popular, right now it's the only game in town. But I realize these are all movable parts. In my opinion, it would be a mistake to reduce that space. That said, my question really is, when you come to maintenance, janitorial, mechanic storage, when we're currently at 12,000, how is it possible to be down to 3,800 square feet?
It's just efficiency in how you're running the operation with things like mechanical and janitorial. They're more centralized instead of having things spread out in different places. In some cases, what we're seeing is that some of the things related to keeping your building clean are becoming, you're going to see robots doing this, and they'll be in a little closet and they'll come out at a pre-programmed time and they'll run around the floor and clean it and sanitize it. And you won't be using the same equipment 15 years from now. There's just, because of how the process is going for maintaining and cleaning and things like that, there's just not as much space. The structure is actually a big part of that in terms of how much space it takes up. And what I see for your building is a really simple, boxy kind of building. And I don't mean that in a way that you can't do something interesting architecturally with it, but that has been the trend with airports, is to not do something with a lot of complexity on the structure because it's expensive. And I mean, it gets expensive very quickly if you start having curvilinear walls and funky structural components. You keep it really simple. And you know, when you're building different components of it were built, the clear spanning wasn't the same. So with different technology on even spanning and holding up roofs, there's not as much structure even needed than what you have. The interior walls that are load bearing will not be the same. A lot of them are not required anymore. So I know it seems like a big jump, and again, this is not tailored to any design or floor plan that's been developed for your airport, because one hasn't been developed. The only way I could see doing that was to look at an airport that had similar traffic patterns, similar volumes, actually a little bit more than you, but kind of in your class, where I had access to architectural drawings that were still at a conceptual level, but that's where I pulled those calcs from. And that's why I just say this is a reference class comparison.
Okay, I have one final question on aircraft positions. We're going from 10 to 7. Is that just better use of space?
Well, we looked at how those are being used and the kind of the way flights were coming in. There's really two things for aircraft parking. One is the gate, whether it's a contact gate, a loading bridge, or whether it's a door you go through, and that's where you load people. And then there's the remain overnight. The remain overnight really doesn't have an impact on the building. It does have an impact on the apron and where you put those airplanes. So the way we looked at it is, if you have 5 gates, you could probably have another 2 parking positions that are close enough that if for some reason you had some weird peak that happened because there was some big event in town, you could load an additional couple of aircraft through ground level loading. If you're making the leap to loading bridges and you install 5 of them, you could still load in a peak situation. You could still load passengers on 2 additional aircraft. We think anything more than that is a stretch. Now, if there are additional aircraft that need to remain overnight, that's something that has to be factored into the apron itself. But close into the terminal, looking at your site, we defined aircraft positions as ones where you could load passengers on.
Thank you. So we've got some questions. I'm going to go first with Director Sani, then Director Sabo, then Director Leffel. So Director Sani, go ahead.
Thank you. I just had a question. I have 2 questions. The security screening checkpoint queue, currently we're at 2,200 square feet, and you're suggesting a 3-time increase. Are we able to provide service currently, or what are we missing, or what would we gain in the future for better service?
I would say that right now you're providing service, but it's not your ideal level of service to the customers. You don't have a pre-check lane, which is really, again, this is a customer service thing that airports decide on. And the TSA is involved in that too, whether they're going to staff it to that level. But at an airport like yours, I believe they would. So you're talking about an extra lane right there. Also, this has most of the offices that the TSA would be in for their various functions. So for example, right now you've got if somebody needs to be pulled out of the line for some private screening, you actually don't have a place for that. They pull somebody into what was an office and still kind of is an office. And so it's sort of awkward. So I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can be by saying that you don't have the ideal screening thing. It's not resulting in people missing flights, but the level of service could be improved. And this is also, and I did say that this is kind of generous sizing. This is also factoring in enough space for the future, enough, we'll call it bandwidth within your building, that if you need to do something different, you can adapt. Airports that were designed and built a long time ago, I'm working with some of them right now, trying to expand their checkpoint, and we're moving structural components, and it's horribly expensive to do. So you don't want it to be the choke point ever, but when you're planning a new one, you definitely don't want there to be some future day when you say, gosh, I wish that thing would have been 5 feet wider. So it's generous.
Okay. Thank you. And I did know, that we certainly had opportunity there. I just didn't know it was 3 times as much. So the janitorial question was asked already, and I just really looked at those 2 deltas. My other question was just retail space. Is in the industry, are we getting away from having retail in airports? And I do agree with Chair Curcio that, our restaurant is special here in this area, and we do have a lot of locals that do come, so it's different than most airports. But is retail changing? And that's it. Thank you.
So retail is changing at airports in a good way. Passenger spend is increasing over time because airports are getting very sophisticated about how they place products and the kind of retail offerings that exist there, and the layouts are different. So it's something that, and I know PFM is probably well aware of this, you look at revenue on a per passenger basis for things like concession. And when you build a new terminal and you've got the opportunity to create some great spaces for selling whatever you want to sell, you have a captive audience. The spending per square foot exceeds by multiples the top revenue malls in the country. So it's very lucrative. The one thing though that works a little bit against you is you have a population that shows up close to flight times. At larger airports, people tend to get there way ahead of their flight because they're afraid of security lines or whatever. And so they're captive in that space longer. You have people that, from my just research observations, talking to folks, they more run it up close to the last minute. So there's not as much time for them to spend money. And so you have to make it easy for them to spend money. So the touchless travel experience is very real, and people, walking up to a concession and grabbing something and not getting out their wallet, just touching their phone to the device, that's increasing, and that will be good. There's another component of it that is emerging, and that's an interesting one. And I don't know how it's going to play out with you, but when people arrive at an airport, this is getting a lot of traction. And how do you keep them there for a little bit longer? If you have a destination restaurant that draws people from town, and people are flying in and maybe their family's coming to meet them, how do you keep them at your airport? If you're a business traveler, you land and you want to get the heck out of there. How do you hold on to that passenger, make it interesting for them to stay in the building for a little bit longer, spend a little more money? So as you work with your architect, you'll have a lot more conversations about things like concessions and the layout and how much of it. So that number could vary quite a bit.
Okay, Director Sabo?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for that presentation, Tom. I have three questions. One of them is back to the concessions thing. It's obviously an important revenue generator. When you put down the figures of 6,000, which we have right now, and reduce it down to 4,500, were you significantly reducing the size of the restaurant, but yet expanding the amount of retail space or retail opportunities for the terminal? Myself clear?
Yeah, so this was my philosophy on it. A part of your restaurant is outdoors, but it's really part of the building. I can see a future building where you have that restaurant and you have a portion that's outdoor and it's not part of the building. So it's not bricks and mortar that you're building. You might have to put pavers down or some kind of a hard surface, but it's literally an outdoor space that people can walk outside the door, either on the secure side or the non-secure. That's a tricky one, how you want to set that up. You can do both. It's not easy to do. TSA gets nervous about it, but I was assuming that if you're going to continue having a large restaurant, you're going to want to have a portion of that be outdoors because you're in a wonderful climate to do that in, but it literally would not be part of the building.
Do you see us expanding our retail space? I mean, expanding our retail opportunities.
I think you'll expand the retail opportunities, but it may not equate to more square footage. I think you'll lay it out differently. You'll lay it out in a way that it's more jumping out at your passenger as they're walking through. So, yeah, I mean, there's only so much for the amount of throughput you have there. It'd be easy to overbuild it and think you're going to get a lot of revenue. So I tried to balance that. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
I get it. On the second question, it regards loading bridges. How much of your vision for our new airport terminal is dependent upon having loading bridges? Or is it inherent? Is it inherent to your design concept?
No, it's not inherent to the design concept. There is no design concept. Although I will say that your terrain lends itself to a main level terminal, single level, with no vertical circulation in there at all. So when you walk in the door and you're getting your ticket, dropping off your luggage, you can see all the way through to where your jet is, and you can see that loading bridge. The topography lends itself to that. If you went with ground loading, you would introduce vertical movement corridors. So I see the lower level of that being support, mechanical, baggage stuff, but all the functional stuff that the passenger sees on the main level. In terms of the loading bridges themselves, this was a huge debate in Aspen, and they're like you. They do ground loading right now, and half the community loves it. They love stepping out of the airplane and smelling, the pine needles. But they made a decision to go with loading bridges for safety reasons. I don't know where you all sit on it. I kind of picked up that you like loading bridges. It is without question a safer way to get people on and off airplanes.
Okay, I get it. So it's optional. Is that
Option.
a statement? Yeah. Okay. The final question is, in your vision, and I know you're not the designer here, but in your other experience, can we approach this due to maybe funding constraints? Can we approach this new terminal with the idea of building an initial structure and designing it so that it can be expanded or added onto as we get more experience with our traffic.
Absolutely. That's exactly what we're doing in Aspen, because they're really afraid of overbuilding. They have budgetary constraints too. And so we're laying that out so that it can be easily added. You have a demising wall on one end and it can be logically grown in one direction. And, they're looking at a fairly simple box kind of structure. It'll still, it'll have a look and feel that is indicative of the kind of environment that they're in, just like you'll have a look and feel that will speak to Monterey. But as far as incremental expansion, it would absolutely be laid out that way.
Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Director Leffel.
Thank you. Tom, a couple of questions. So the jet bridges for me that's just imperative because of our older population. And it does feel a lot safer. Also because we have inclement weather. And for me, it's not real nice to walk out and get your hair kind of wet or your shoes wet and then get on a plane for a couple hours. So I think that's important. One of the problems we have right now is because our terminal had to keep adjusting after 9/11 is our hold area for our passengers after they go through TSA is really not, it's not a good size when we get some late flights. And Allegiant is probably the worst in our group. But when we've got a pretty full Allegiant flight going to Vegas and then a couple other planes are on time, we don't have the capacity. So I think also with COVID, it's really important to know that we've got enough space once they get through that. So are you seeing the trend that there's a whole lot more space on the after security check piece so that they can A, shop, B, get some food, and have the space around that they need in order to not be on top of each other?
This has been a huge topic of conversation in the industry, as you can imagine. And Mike peppered me right away when I first, we're talking about these numbers, the 6 foot, social distancing spacing. The industry is not going to go to having square footage requirements. IATA is not going to redo their guidebook and because that's going to require 4 times the space. And airports aren't going to do that. But what they are going to do, what's emerging very quickly is managing crowds and queues differently. This isn't anything new, but I think it's going to be adapted in a different way. There was a new terminal built in Houston at Intercontinental, B South, and it's they have what they call a call to gate concept, where it's really a pretty brilliant idea. They hold people in a large area with concessions, with restaurants and shops, and you don't know what gate your flight is until they're ready to board, and then they call you in, and then you go to the hold room gate area. So it's a really efficient way to manage space. But with COVID now, and however else that might manifest itself, or however people might feel about it, or the belief is that technology and processes will be how crowds are managed, not by adding 4 times the square footage.
Okay. And then we obviously are a golf community, and a lot of people who fly in with clubs. So, and I know that that's been a problem with our baggage handling forever because we have an antiquated system and it really wasn't designed for the new style. So the baggage handling, I'm guessing, is so that we can handle all that oversized equipment.
And that's why it was bumped from what you have now. It was increased.
Okay. And then we have a huge military population, and I know from talking to my friend at United, that is one reason why we kept some of the flights that we kept, because they've got contracts and they want to keep them. So if we were to really market that community, which we really have not, but if we really marketed that community, when they rotate, because our population is very transient, they come in for 6-month classes or for a 1-year class or whatever. And when they leave, they're oftentimes going someplace and they've got everything they're taking with them. And we need to have enough baggage handling also for all those huge duffel bags and the things that go with particularly the young people. They're kind of like snails with what they've got on their backs. So it just, I guess what I'm saying is I just want us to make sure that we've got something that if we aggressively marketed that, we could handle it.
Yeah, I'm going to make a note on that because what I'd be curious about, and I don't know this, is the timing of those flights. Because if it's something that happens in between peaks or at a slower time, or the flight times can be managed, or you as an airport can direct them and say, hey, we really would prefer that you run those flights within this time period, then you're not adding to the peak. You're not taking a really busy period and exacerbating it. So I'd want to know a little bit more about the timing of those flights, when they happen, the frequency of them, and then I think that's something that I would want to look at again and see if it may not warrant some additional space just for that.
Well, I know they all break at Christmas time, and I know that we got surprised, I'm going to use that word, on how many, all of a sudden we had like 80 people show up with MPs in our terminal right before Christmas. And we really didn't, we were not prepared for them. And the restaurant wasn't prepared for them. And we didn't know they were coming. So we had a lot of people there with a lot of stuff. So the other thing is, once NPS is up and running, we have a lot of foreign officers. And when they come, they're paid for by their foreign government. When they leave, they have purchased things like 60-inch televisions and computers and all kinds of things that they cannot get in their country.
Yeah.
And they want to have them to present to the head of their tribe or their government when they get home. So they want to take them with them. And it's been, some of the problems been eliminated because we have larger planes now that are going out.
Yeah.
But they require a lot of baggage handling also. So it's just, I think we're maybe a little unique in some of the weird things that come through, partly because of our tourists and partly because of our military. But
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. That's a lot more granular information that I had to work with. And yeah, let me take a look at the military component and see if that might change anything. I think the timing of it is a big component of it, but the volume is also a factor.
well, what happens is we lose those passengers because they can't depend on us to move their extra things. And
Got it.
so then they take transportation to San Francisco instead of using us. So.
Got it.
And then
Okay.
the last thing, I know Mr. Dawson is one of our participants. I see him here. But no matter what, in our conference room, boardroom, we have to have a really nice table set up for donuts. That's it. We cannot not have that.
Director Miller. Director Miller.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I found it very interesting. Staying close to our same size or getting smaller, which doesn't surprise me. I just know that our building has morphed over many decades and probably not the most efficient use of space. A couple things though. I always thought that a premium lounge would do well here. And I know we're not big enough to have an own separate airline lounge, but like San Jose has a combined lounge. Just with the status, the premium status of many of our travelers have, I think that would benefit, especially if that round business. You echo what everybody said about the restaurant. Our restaurant does about 80% of their business is people not utilizing the airport. So it does need to be big enough to accommodate that. And retail sales, yeah, I think you hit it right on the head there. That people that come to this airport, one of their main attractions is they get in late and get on their plane with very few hassles. So we don't really have them captive that long. I know some airports have gone to vending machines. Have you thought about that? And with most airline businesses, one particular company has the entire contract for food service and retail sales. Just curious what you envisioned there.
Okay, there were a number. I'll try to hit most of your points here. If I miss something, please feel free to repeat. It was a little choppy coming in, but the first thing on some sort of a executive lounge. I don't see an airline developing one at your size airport. They just don't do it at that size. But I do see two possibilities. Some airports develop their own, and they have their Harrisburg, Pennsylvania has the Susquehanna Club, which doesn't cost anything to be a member of, but you have to sign something and you can go in, and it's a little lounge, and they have mints and coffee and things like that. And it's just something that they run. It's a little amenity. But there are private companies that are building lounges at airports that will simply come in and, you can set up the parameters for what how you get into those. But if you're a member of, say Delta Sky Club, you don't automatically become a member of these things. It's a separate thing that people would have to generally pay for. But that is something that can be built in. That would be adding square footage to this. It would be adding cost. You'd be building it out. But there are companies that are very happy to help you design those, staff those, and run those. Let's see, the
vending machines for retail sales, and how you envision retail here, because like in most bigger airports, the concessionaire runs all the stores.
Yeah, and it's really common that you'll have a master concessionaire that does everything, but usually you have some sort of a framework with them, a framework agreement about how much space they're going to build out, how they're going to build it out, what kind of shops are gonna be there. So it varies. Not every airport has a master concessionaire. It's just one way of running it. I'm not as familiar with the vending, if that is usually done with a master concessionaire or if that's just done separately with vending companies. I mean, you probably, if anybody's traveling, you're seeing vending machines pop up with, protective gear these days, and makeup and electronic goods and some very high-end things that you can buy from a vending machine. So I think they're just becoming a part of life. It's an automated way to put a lot of products in. It's not limited to, cans of soda and candy bars anymore. There's a lot of different things you can do with that. Requires very little overhead and very little space. But as you get closer to really defining what that interior looks like, you'll look at the flow of passengers, how people are actually going to move through the building, and try to make those different offerings conveniently located to so that people are get really close to it and can see it, and can almost taste what's in those vending machines. Now, was there another point in there that I may have missed? I want to make sure I address everything.
I think you did. Thank you.
Okay.
Executive Director, where do we go from here?
Okay, Tom, are you complete with your?
Well, we got just a couple more slides. I can wrap this up pretty quickly. I was just going to talk about how this translates into costs and our methodology for doing that. So this is the cost comparison. You had an estimate in your master plan of 100,000 square foot terminal, and these are the various costs that are baked into it. The passenger boarding bridges were not part of that, but we added it in just so it was an apples to apples comparison. So, you're at about 81 million at that point. With the revised square footage estimate, these are really, we largely just prorated it based on this cost estimating, but I did look at other similar terminal programs and what was happening with actual construction costs. And I had a few recent ones to go off of. Aspen is one that is maybe a little bit more on the high side because they're kind of isolated. Fresno was one where I did some terminal planning and they're going into design now. And so I kind of use those as references. I don't think San Diego is a great reference. Their process of developing is different than what yours going to be. But you can see the kind of price range that you're in. The loading bridges, that's based on actually talking to the manufacturers about the glass loading bridges, the new fancy special ones. So that's where that pricing comes from. Yeah, and that's where you're at. So I think this is what really is the bottom line, where we expected PFM would pick it up and use these numbers to run through their financial model. Yeah, I've got some things, in the later slides that are more just capturing a few things about trends in terminal design, if you're interested in talking about any of those things. But this was really the result that Mike and his crew asked for, to help us right size the building, do it in a rational way, and tell us how that changes the cost.
What does design range mean?
Couple of things. It's really a contingency. We call it different things. Sometimes we call it design evolution, and 20% is a really common figure to use at this really early conceptual stage. So that means on top of construction costs, and you already have your architect and engineering fees in there, we're saying that you might hire an architect who's a very high-end architect and likes fancy things. You may do something very exotic. And so we've increased the price by 20% to account for that, because it's unknown. You don't have an architect yet. You don't know what they're going to design. That when you start to, and we also don't know how, are you going to have a really fancy structure and roofing system that's going to be iconic, because that can add to costs a lot. The next step is going to be more of a program definition where you make some decisions about those things. And you either say, yes, we want a Frank Gehry curvilinear wild thing that people will never forget, or you decide we're going to do something simple, geometric, and then that 20% contingency goes down, because now you've taken some of the questions off the table, and you're giving your architect some boundaries.
Thank you.
Now, we keep that number high to be conservative, because there's a lot more to be done when you design it.
Very good.
Director Miller, you have your hand up?
By mistake, sorry. Let me take it down.
All right.
Okay.
Public comment?
Sure. Go ahead.
Did he say sure? I do have some comments. Mike Dawson here. Have we ever had, other than the obvious Allegiant difficulty, have we ever had too many passengers all lined up and not be able to throughput them?
Mike, to answer the question, not the way you described it, but we have had several occasions, particularly in 2019, when we saw a significant growth spurt, where we had multiple aircraft on the ground at the same time. And it did impact the throughput through the security checkpoint. We had much longer lines than we normally would experience because of that. Not an insurmountable problem, but it really goes to the question that Tom covered, and I think covered quite well, about the checkpoint itself and the sizing of that. You get one real kick at that can, and when you're building a terminal building, that's an easy kick. You can do that one once really well, and that was the intent behind Tom's effort here, was, at least in that component, is to make sure that if we do it well the first time, we don't have to redo it again until such time as we exceed the growth opportunities in the terminal.
I know what we've been doing here for this whole exercise is we've been walking around peak design. If in fact we can control some of that peak design, like during the morning push or during the mid-afternoon push, then we could see forward that we wouldn't need quite so big a terminal because we don't have any crowding, because peak design is working. A question about FAA. What percentage of the costs of a terminal would they be likely to carry?
Stay with us, Mike. That question's going to be answered in some detail, both in the next presentation and in my follow-up.
Okay, excellent. Just a comment. Someone said that restrooms are a real big deal in airports. You betcha. I think that the restrooms at Monterey are the best that I've been through, and I've been through a hell of a lot of them. I've been through some bad ones, but the ones here are the best. Thank you.
Thanks.
Director Leffel?
Thank you. I had one more question. Tom, the Monterey Salinas Transit a few years ago was going to build a maintenance facility. And what they did is they paid another district that had designed a facility. It was like the same size district, and it had gotten complete funding. So they paid them for the plans, which reduced the other district's overall cost. And they modified them a little bit, but have you seen anything where, I'll choose Aspen. Aspen does one, they've got the same size kind of general layout that we have. So they reduce their costs by kind of cost sharing some basic plans with another airport.
I don't know if I've ever seen that. Are you talking about actual architectural design?
Yeah,
Yeah.
what you were saying about, hey, if you make the box, you don't try to make it like San Jose's with all the curves and all of that. If you make the box with the basics, with the jet bridges and that sort of thing, some of that seems to be pretty, to me, basic. I mean, you have to have it in every airport. So I just wondered if there was any way to kind of show our thriftiness and frugality and ability to kind of be flexible and use something that someone else has started and reduce our design costs by, who knows, $1 million or $2 million.
I think the site, because the sites for terminal buildings are different at every airport, and the elevations you're dealing with are very different. Structures, obviously, especially substructures, are going to be different. It's a really interesting question you're posing, and I wish I could point to an example where somebody did that. I don't have one. I actually had, I had thought about this a long time ago because I read an article in Engineering News Record about a hospital in Indianapolis that was built with modular components, an entire hospital. You know, pieces of it that were assembled in a factory and stacked on top of each other like Legos, and that concept has played out with housing to some degree, manufactured. Not talking mobile homes, I'm talking high-end stuff. But I have not seen that play out with airports at all. I'm not going to say it can't happen, but as you talk to architects, which ultimately you will, you're going to be going out for selecting an architect at some point, and that would be a really great question to ask them.
Well, I mean, I know they're like artists. They want to do their thing and have their stamp on it, believe me. But I also just am reticent to spend money that we don't need to on something basic. And I get we're on a hill and we have a slope and we have all of that. But the building is the building. When you're talking about the TSA part and the baggage handling and all of that, there have to be some things that are just kind of the same.
Yeah.
So I would just ask all of you who are consulting with us and our staff to do it, and maybe we set the pace and we do something different that no one else has done, and show that we're really not just crazily spending tax dollars.
I will say that there are architects, many architects, I would say most architects, that have a certain portion of the design that they like, that is kind of their signature, that you'll see repeated. And that's so they don't have to redesign it again. Bathrooms are like.
But you always pay for that because it is their design. They are lazy. They just like to make their little stamp on it. So I don't know. I think there's some merit to it. And when I watched MST have it, and they got it approved through both the federal funding, through DOT, and through state funding. So there may be an opportunity.
Yeah, there could be. I'm not going to say it isn't within the realm of possibilities. You may end up with something a little more on the generic side if you go that route, and that's up to you. That's a choice on, you know, how far you want to go with the actual design and customization. Architects do like to customize, but I think a lot of times, just so that a building like this, a public building, really reflects the community well, and that manifests itself in the walls and the floor and everything. So I would not take an Aspen design and drop it into Monterey. I think it would look silly. But maybe there is some template that could be adapted.
Well, I will say this, the building that we have is so damn dysfunctional. And that was like some architect's big award winning design that everybody thought was the cat's meow in 1952. And every time I take 2 elevators to get from our parking lot to the restaurant, I just shake my head.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, I think I'm very practical, and I think there might be a way for us to cut some costs there.
Okay.
And I don't really care about an architect's ego. I think, you know, you pay them for what you want. Thank you, Chair.
All right, Tom, I'm sorry, Director Sabo, do you have another question?
Just a quick one. Tom, if in fact we opted to have a little more of a minimal estimate of employments, annual employments and peak employments, let's say we had instead of a 100% increase, we had a 60% increase. Would that affect our construction costs and our construction range costs to any consequence?
Yeah, it could. I mean, you'd be building a smaller terminal if you had less people you were expecting. Absolutely. You could do
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, Tom, anything else you want to wrap with?
I feel like I've talked way more than Mike was probably expecting me to talk, so.
Well,
With your question, you've had a lot of great questions. I know this is an important thing for you, and I'll continue to work through Mike and Chris and Dan. If there's any follow-up things that you want me to look into, I have a couple here that are not big lifts that I'll respond back through them on some questions that came up and get some clarification on the military, a few other things. So I've made a few notes there, but I do appreciate, your time listening to me. I appreciate the opportunity to work for you. You have a wonderful staff there that has been a joy to work with, and it's a really interesting opportunity that you have, and I know you just want to do it right. So appreciate the opportunity to help you out.
All right. Thanks much, Tom. Before we go to item 2, I want to take a 5-minute quick break, and then we'll come back. So let's take 5.
Very good.
Will pay. And so even if you have an agreement and it's 3 to 5 years, I mean, that's great. It shows some level of commitment from the airlines. It shows some level of risk transfer. But, the lender's going to maybe making a 30-year decision. And so they're still going to have some level of, is this an airport that is going to continue to have a sufficient level of service? And they're going to look at the demand characteristics. Is there strong demand for service, strong enough demand to warrant, a high enough, ticket price to be attractive to the carriers relative to the cost of operating at that airport, as well as competition, and what they believe the dynamics to be between the other regional and Bay Area airports, and is there a risk that that service could go away and still meet that? Does that demand still be met in some other fashion? And so that's all built in. So an airline agreement goes a long way, but it's these days there's just not, especially for airports of this size with this type of capital development, it's not going to be a 30-year agreement. It's not going to cover the length of the debt. So the lenders are going to have to get some comfort that, whether there's an airline agreement, whether it's 30 days or 5 years, that after that period, the carriers are still incentivized to provide service here. And so, it's a harder question to answer these days. Is it possible? Yes. Is it a certainty that they would enter into an agreement, particularly at a high cost structure? No. But they may want some more control. They may want some participation in non-aeronautical revenues, and so they may be willing to, but it's hard to tell in this circumstance.
Will the availability of airline agreements affect our bond rating at the time if we went forward to issue bonds?
It likely would affect it. Again, an argument could be made that it shouldn't, but I think it's safe to say that the rating agencies would prefer some form of agreement. It may not be paramount though, and again, the onus would be on providing comfort around the demand dynamics and the like, and that can overcome, even if it is a notch rating, so we call it a triple B rather than a triple B plus, or a triple B plus rather than an A minus. That is not a deal killer, so to speak. That is, it's a higher cost by an incremental amount, but in this environment, that's really not a terribly high amount. And so it may impact it, but it's probably not enough on its own to cause cause you not to be able to secure debt. And especially if you can demonstrate, some comfort around the demand characteristics and propensity for continued service.
Okay, I was questioning the interest rates that you were using, which definitely are a factor in our debt service obligations. You kind of, and I may have misunderstood, but you were remarking that our interest rates, our 10-year bond money or 10-year treasuries are at an all-time low right now. And I didn't see you comment about any escalation in the interest rates going forward, because we're still 4 to 5 years out from actually issuing these bonds. What is the impact of maybe a 1.5% increase in the interest rate? And is this maybe a deal killer for us?
Again, I don't think, similarly to why a significantly lower interest rate doesn't make it all of a sudden, a slam dunk, a higher interest rate doesn't make it a deal killer. The assumptions that were used, resulted in an all-in TIC of 4.3%. There is assumptions behind that as to the specific interest rates that you might achieve, and we're assuming both a little bit of cushion in terms of credit. So we're not assuming that that we're being pretty conservative in our assumptions around the credit profile, and we're also assuming about 50 to 100 basis points, which is about 0.1% of cushion to account for the fact that we're well away from borrowing. Excuse me. And to your question, an impact in about 1.5%. I don't have the exact figure, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, not millions. And so I would say it makes it tougher. It's a higher hurdle. It's certainly a slight increment in cost, a greater revenue amount that you need to generate, and it's greater risk because you do need to generate that higher amount of revenue, and you have less room, for a bad year or a downturn in traffic or the like. But it's in the hundreds of thousands. It's not in the millions range. It is not as impactful as for instance, the $20 million, that really, that kind of helps move the needle by a more substantial amount, the FAA contribution. And like I said, with that, you're then less interest rate sensitive.
Okay, I get it. Thank you. And now, regarding the additional funding from the FAA towards the terminal of $20 million, what has been your experience with other airports our size or in our category regarding acquisition of that additional FAA funding towards terminal costs? Do you have any information you could provide us on that?
I don't have too much specific example, and that may segue a bit to Mike here, and to some of the strategy. But I will say it is not common for the FAA to make substantial investments in a terminal. It somewhat depends on the airport size and function, and certainly, there's some airports that almost rely entirely upon federal funding, but don't have much in the way at all of other traffic. But as you start to get to commercial service airports, it's less common. But the FAA isn't only thinking of precedent. I think they're also thinking of the importance of this airport, the importance to the national air system, the need, so to speak, and the financial viability without their support. And so, you know, there's not a ton of examples of it that I know of, but there's so much differentiation in airports. You know, you're in this area where you're self-sufficient, but you're not generating the same types of revenues that a small or medium hub airport may generate. And so that, I think, is the kind of the argument to the FAA is, you know, while we have commercial service, we need some help, and that will go a long way. Yeah.
Did Aspen get any additional money for their terminal?
They have not gotten it yet. They're still lobbying to get it. Big difference with Aspen is not a safety project. It's a pure replacement, whereas Monterey has a safety element to it. So Monterey will stack up higher in actually getting that money. It's hard to get discretionary money for terminals.
Okay, I guess I was asking the wrong guy. I just have one. I have one final question, and that's on PPE, Mary. If we were to enter into a PPE agreement based upon your experience with other ventures like this, would the partner have the rights to set rates and charges or particularly concessions and rental space in the terminal and all that? Do we give up that right? I understand we'd be the final approving authority, but are we essentially giving up that right to set rates and charges?
I mean, you would have the ability to set parameters around which they would set those rates and charges, but it would be, they would own the revenue, to kind of put it in an accounting term, but they would, you can build in as many controls over that as you want. I mean, ultimately, that's part of that cost benefit analysis and risk reward analysis that we would help you undertake, but they would ultimately be entering into those agreements with the airlines and other tenants in the building.
Okay, they need enough. I guess I'm correcting the assumption. They would need enough in the rates and charges to assure that they're meeting their obligations and hopefully projecting a profit here. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so, you know, part of the conversation with them and how what form your agreement with them takes is giving them the latitude that they need in order to generate sufficient profit to get them to come in and build this terminal for you, versus your kind of public policy interest in making sure that, you know, there's a level of affordability and some amount of control over just kind of how much profit they take.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And Mr. Chairman, those are my questions. I have some at the end of all this. I'd like to share some thoughts from my position as a director on things that we need to do going forward. So I'm done.
All right, thanks, Bill. Director Miller.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, both of you. There's a lot of information, but as I understand it, and correct me if we go with the private design build option, FAA will not fund any part of that, correct?
So you would still continue to collect your PFCs. You would still be able to get your airfield. I mean, it's conceivable that you know, depending upon the conversations with the FAA, that because ultimately the question of the FAA funding is on the affordability of the terminal, and to Tom's earlier point, you know, the idea that there's a safety component here. The presence of the private partner may not avoid or may not eliminate the eligibility of the project for FAA funding for the terminal. Again, you know, as as Tom had indicated, the FAA tends not to fund terminal projects, but again, the safety component. So, there's an opportunity, I think, here to sort of go down parallel paths, potentially get, and also just be forthright with the FAA about, some of the procurement alternatives that you're thinking about, so that, as you acknowledge that, it's something that they take into consideration, but the project itself should sort of stand on its own to some extent. And the FAA, on a further point, the FAA has had different perspectives. I mean, they've encouraged, to a certain extent, alternative delivery. The US DOT broadly has encouraged alternative delivery as a way of improving the nation's infrastructure, and so that might have an impact there as well.
So how many successful examples of this are out there? And you said that, I didn't remember picking it up.
So there's some very large examples of privately developed terminals.
Our size.
So the most recent examples are some of the large terminals in the New York area. So at LaGuardia Airport just did a very large terminal redevelopment that was done as a public-private partnership. Other terminals at Kennedy Airport have been done using these 30-year concession agreements. There are a handful of smaller airports that have done sort of either project development, terminal development. There's not a lot actually at this point. There's quite a few that have been under consideration. Painfield, actually, although that's up in the Seattle area, is an example of a recently accomplished project.
Yeah, there's a much longer list of ones that are that have pursued it or are pursuing it or thinking about it than there are, at least in America, of a list of those that have actually entered into something. I think to date it's largely been kind of discrete projects and or much larger kind of scope than that Mary's referring to, but of your airport size, that's actually been completed, there's not much.
I think there was one in the south somewhere by Branson, was a private airport that went in. But what would happen in the case where the business gets into financial troubles, maybe not because of our airport, but because of other holdings that they have? What happens then? And does the courts come in? Do we lose? It sounds like we give up a lot of control with this.
So what would happen if the concessionaire was having financial difficulties? So what happens, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to sound like one for another minute. The concessionaire will form a limited liability company. It'll have equity participate. It'll have funds that sort of front the equity associated with it, but it'll be kind of ring fenced. And so if their other holdings have financial problems, they would, it shouldn't impact, and actually part of the whole process is making sure that this organization can't be brought into bankruptcy by any of its other activities. I mean, to the extent that it's a commercial venture, and so if the commercial venture experienced any difficulties and they weren't able to pay their debts when they come due, if they were deemed bankrupt, if their lenders had to step in, the lenders would basically become the concessionaire, and you would have certain controls over how that right got transferred, but and there's risks sort of across the delivery spectrum. I don't mean to sound glib about it, but so you get your terminal built and your concessionaire can't manage it, files for bankruptcy, they walk away, you have your terminal and you kind of start from scratch in terms of your relationship with the airlines. And so it's not that easy. I don't mean to make it sound that easy, but these deals are structured in ways to protect your interest, but also allow them to be able to raise the funds that they need.
And I think a component of that, right, Mary, is whether or not, or their ability to kind of sell their interest or sell their investment. And that's, one of the risks is that the partner that you started with isn't the partner that you end up with. And if you try to protect that and you try to limit their ability to do so, it greatly impacts the attractiveness of that investment to them, right? So if they think that they can't sell it or get out of it or make a return on it, that's going to greatly impact their willingness to participate. But on the other hand, if that is something that they can do, it increases the chance that you're that you're now working with somebody different than who you set out with, and you'll have a different partner at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, you would have certain rights to control, who they would be able to transfer to or sell it to, but again, I'll sort of use another legal term, that consent, can't be unreasonably withheld. I mean, you've got to have a good reason for why you might not allow them to transfer the asset.
Thank you.
Is that it, Director Miller? Are you finished?
I am done.
Thank you. Director Leffel?
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. It was very informative. So one of the things that I keep looking at is the cost of borrowing, and a private investor is going to have a much higher cost traditionally than those of us who can go out for tax-free bonds and other things. And it seems like we're also much more able to go out for a longer term debt than a lot of private investors. So I'm just wondering, I'm in Kauai right now, so I came through San Jose and Honolulu and Lahui, and there's nothing open. I mean, you look at all of the financial models they did on all of their new terminals with concessionaires, and it's frightening. They're all shuttered completely. So I look at this and I just wonder how that is going to change anybody's appetite for investing in any kind of a terminal. We're kind of a one-off because we don't really have that many concessionaires in the terminal that aren't totally airline related. We don't have all the little kiosks and everything else going on, but it's I don't know, when I look at it, I'm just wondering who in their right mind at this point, looking at what's happened the last year, would want to invest in a terminal at this point. The other piece of it being that we are in a very litigious community, and our last two projects, the one we're on right now and the one we finished before, we were sued twice on the last one. We're on the first lawsuit on this one. I wouldn't preclude that we'll get to the end without another one somewhere down the line. So the cost of doing business in Monterey County is unfortunately much higher than it is some of the other places that somebody might want to put their money. I think you said that we would also possibly give them maybe a first right of refusal on other development projects or things like that to sweeten the pot, which means then you're just further in bed with them and have no control over any of your revenue to try if they went if they had a problem, you don't have any other recourse, but then just to sue them and write it out and pay your attorney fees, right? I mean, the more.
So, yeah. I just a couple of comments on a few of your points. So yeah, their cost of capital is higher. They've been able to borrow for these types of projects for almost as long as a governmental entity might be able to borrow for it. But a lot of it depends upon how long the agreement that you have with the private partner. So the economics for them only work if they're able to do things faster, better, cheaper. That they get some benefits on their design build, value engineering. So on the project delivery, that they're able to make more money on the concessions because they know better where to put them in the terminal and things like that. So their economics are really driven by those elements, with the acknowledgement that they do have a higher cost of capital because their borrowing rate is higher and they've got to make a reasonable return on equity. As Brian had indicated, a lot of them are looking sort of through the cycle currently. At least over the summer, they were looking through the cycle. I think these equity investors have money to invest, and so they're looking for places. And it's not very patient money, so they're willing to put it to work when they're sort of thinking through the cycle. And then just in terms of the litigiousness of the community, I mean, that's why I kept saying stakeholder management. I mean, this would need to be kind of well vetted. It's very in a very transparent process. And with some kind of making sure that there's reasonably good community support out there, because if there's anything that the equity community is afraid of, it's prolonged litigation that's going to keep them from moving the project forward. So that they would want that all sort of straightened out and buttoned up before they would contemplate this kind of a project.
Unfortunately, in our community, you could do that all you want, and one will come out of the woodwork, and when you least expect it. The $20 million increase, so I'm going to address this to Mike, I think. Is this part of the ask that we made that they release the cap on small and medium hub airports on terminals?
It is. It's tied to that. And part of my presentation, which we can go into now or later, FAA currently has programmed us for $50 million. And their comment to us has been over the life of the program, which is clearly not enough. But their comment to us has been $20 million. We don't care where you spend it. It's got to come out of that $50 million. They're fine with the terminal building. There are certain provisions that you have to meet in a terminal building to be eligible, to have that portion of the building eligible, but they understand that that they may well be a participant in that building, and they're not objecting to that. Our effort going forward is to do two things. One, lift that cap, because the reauthorization legislation caps FAA participation in a non-hub airport terminal building at $20 million. So we've asked that cap be lifted so we could actually ask for more or use more if we're successful operating. Secondly, we're going to need more funds. And part of what we're doing with FAA is part of the negotiations. The next step for us will be to take this information, take our professionals to FAA and begin the negotiations of moving that $50 million programming number farther north. Brian's numbers showed somewhere in the $88 million range is what we would probably need. That's probably a pretty good target for us. So yes, we can use AIP dollars in the terminal building. The challenge for us is going to be to articulate how we're going to use those in the terminal building and also to expand the pot from 50 million. So I hope that answered the question.
So we know, for instance, that our congressman is very pro lifting the cap. And he said to me
Correct.
just a couple of weeks ago that he's willing to, as long as we don't hang him out there, he's willing to kind of take it forward and help us get there. So I think that's to our benefit. Then the other thing that is kind of hanging out there, has been hanging out there since we all came on the board, is to raise the PFCs. And I know that I thought that Schumer was the person who really did not want us to do that. Is that correct?
That is still correct. He's still one of the opponents to raising PFCs. He's not a fee-based guy.
So the fact that we didn't get it done in the
Hopefully
last
we can
4
work through that.
years, we may be SOL with him in the
We
driver's seat.
may. Yeah, I've not heard anything about PFC increase as part of the reauthorization legislation yet, but I'm certain it will be there. There will at least be discussion whether or not there will be activity to move it north. I don't. Certainly the alphabet groups that we belong to are all knocking on the door trying to have conversations.
Okay, and then I'm going to address TIFIA a minute because I'm working with them on another project, and it's like they've got this pot of money, but they got people in charge of it that don't know what the hell they can do. And so they all just kind of run around and talk to each other, and then you meet with them again the next month and same thing. It's pretty ridiculous. I could eliminate some federal budget dollars by eliminating some of those people and just get somebody that could say yes or no. But the thing is, I did talk to MSP briefly about, and this is just an idea, because we have to have bus service. We have to have some kind of interconnection in order to qualify for TIFIA. So we know we've got a huge problem with the traffic going into Carmel, Monterey, Pacific Grove, and the amount of traffic that it's clogged up on Highway 1 in the afternoon. So I'm just throwing this out there. A thought is to have a conversation with them, to have on some of our property a park and ride where people could come from outside the area and get on an MST rapid transit to go into those cities, to their positions, to their schools or their jobs. And I think then we would more fully qualify for TIFIA, because I'm sitting in TIFIA meetings every month now on this other project, and I hear them go back and forth, and I hear them go back and forth with DOT and with Caltrans, and my head wants to explode because I know that there have to be some simple ways, logical ways that you can solve this. But I think we might get there if we could somehow work a deal with Monterey Salinas Transit and help our community in the long run by getting some of those cars off the road. So, and it also would go, Gary, to the hospitality industry to maybe move some of their service workers in and out during peak periods. So anyway, I'm just going to throw that out there as everybody's looking at all of this. There may be some ways to make some of this work a little bit better. And based on all of this, I have some thoughts on public-private partnerships and on all that, but I'll hold that. But thank you for the presentation and for clarifying some of this, Brian and Mary.
Great. And real quick, maybe on the TIFIA front, I would just add, we've had, many of those same experiences, worked with, like I said, an airport that was very far along the process. They were having bi-weekly meetings with the TIFIA folks, and it just kind of sputtered out. You're right in that multimodal connection is needed and can be helpful. What the TIFIA folks were really struggling with is how far that can go into a terminal building, and particularly, if the people using using the other transportation sources are not, if the TIFIA funding is not sort of supporting their connection, from one transportation source to another, that's where the struggle lies. And so, for instance, if it's a bus most of the people on the bus are going, using it for some non-airport purpose, or are not going, from that bus through security to, to a loading bridge. They were really struggling to get there on that, right? And say, well, how can we fund the terminal if that's not really part of this multimodal, and so it was a struggle to get them to make that connection. There's talk about walkability, if you can walk from one place to another, and certainly you could, right? If you had a terminal, a bus terminal, and you were walking from there through security onto your plane. But then is that what everybody's doing, and is that what the purpose of that is? And so those are the hurdles that just seemed insurmountable. And there was a bit of, on the one hand, they were saying, we really want to support airport projects. We have a lot, like you said, we have a lot of money and we need to do something with it. But on the other, some other part of the program is saying, well, no, it doesn't meet this mandate and we can't get there. The hope is that there's new leadership from a airport perspective in the program that is trying to open that up and either figure out a way to get over that hurdle, or to just create a new program that's specifically designed for airports, and to get federal funding to airports. Again, there's a lot of money available. It is seemingly a bipartisan thing, and it is something that seemingly this administration is interested in terms of infrastructure development and the like. So there's optimism, but that was the hurdle that we never seemed to be able to get over from an airport perspective, even with some connection to busing or mass transit.
Thank you.
Director
Yes,
Sawhney?
Dr.
Thank you both for the informative presentation and lots of information to digest and kind of good baseline for us. I had a question about slide 34, and Mary, you had presented at that time. Not sure if the question's for you, but just the valuation of looking at PPP. Can you just describe that a little bit more? What would you go into that? Is it demand and current flights? Is it growth projections? Is it comparing similar airports? You're on mute.
So I would say it's a combination of all of those things. Actually, it's the catchphrase of 2021, 2020. So it's a combination of all those things. It's to a large extent like the analytics that Brian's already done in terms of the feasibility. It's looking at some of on the construction side, what a private party might be able to bring in terms of value engineering, design innovation that would enable sort of for a lower cost. The whole life costing issues kind of get factored in, and so you look at things on a present value basis from that standpoint. And then what the opportunity is for some kind of enhanced commercial development, and then those other elements that we were talking about in terms of sort of non-aviation related commercial development. So it's kind of looking at the package of the opportunity as well as the cost side.
Okay.
I might just quickly add that it's very difficult to put ourselves in their shoes for that valuation. It's so tailored to their individual circumstances. I mean, one thing that's clear is that these investors really run a range of type and what they're looking for, and some of them are running, large investment funds that have a mandate and they got to put money to work, and they're mostly concerned about hitting a return threshold. Others, as Mary said, maybe they're really getting their money more on the construction side, and so it's less of a return investment and more of trying to put together a package deal where they get money from a variety of parts of the package. And so they're going to value it way differently. And so part of the process is providing them enough information for them to start going through that process and determining what they, where they come out on it. And it's just, it's unlike a traditional financing mechanism where we sort of know where the market is. That is such a dispersed market that there's no good way to know until you start a process with them and start something a little bit more formal, give them something to chew on, and then they can start to indicate where they're coming out on it, and then it's iterative from there.
Okay. Thank you.
So Director Leffel covered most of what I wanted to talk about. I do want to reiterate one point that she was speaking to, and that was when Mary talked on initial investor outreach and research, the bullet point on political will and local support really creates a big problem for us in our community. So it would be in being as transparent as we need to be in whatever partner might possibly be interested. It is a really long uphill pull to try to have anything of any value happen in this community. So I'm just getting that on the table because it's unfortunately a fact of what we face in operating here in Monterey. So, Mr. Dawson, I know you've been waiting patiently, and we really don't need to have public comment in this type of a session, but I absolutely want to hear what you have to say. Would you like to make some public comment?
I have no comment except that some of my questions from the last issue were answered, and thank you for that, because the FAA funding is I think is kind of crucial, and for me to hear that could happen, although it's not likely, is very, very good news.
Thank you, Mr. Dawson. So, Executive Director, what are your thoughts about anything moving? I guess I'm hemming and hawing here, but what do you think of the idea of possibly having your review and next steps move to our next board agenda?
I'm absolutely fine with that. I think there's been a lot of information that's been dumped on your plates. It's probably good for you to digest that. There's been some that will cause me to want to change a couple of things in my recommendations going forward as well. So I'm fine with that.
So that being said, Director Sabo, I know you have some additional comments you'd like to make. So would you like to make those comments at this point, or is it more appropriate that you make them after we've heard what Mr. Lapierre has to say?
Well, I would have preferred to hear what Mike had to say. I blocked out time for this because this was like drinking out of a fire hose to even go through the slides ahead of time. But I had some comments here, and I would like to provide some considerations for the board from one board member. These are kind of factors or questions we need to get answered. The first and foremost one is I was a little concerned about the lack of what is termed sensitivity analysis regarding passenger growth. Right now, both of our moderate and our aggressive passenger employment figures, which also expands on to the size of the terminal, is based on 150% and 200% increase over 1998. I would like to see a sensitivity analysis of maybe a 70 to 80% increase over 1998, and so that we would understand what our terminal requirements are, what our concession requirements are, and most importantly, what the impact is going to be on our debt service. And I think that's very important for us to go in and have a range of prognostications. There is no reference to using taxpayer money in this thing for obvious reasons. My real question here, I guess, is if we build a new terminal, I understand we're calling it a safety project. If we build a new terminal, is that going to result in an increase in passenger seats and passengers using this terminal? And I think it's very important for us because I don't want to be one director that leads us down into the path of being over our heads with debt service. The other consideration factors that I think we need to consider are this question of airline agreements. And I'd like Mike to speak to that the next time we get together. We haven't had airline agreements. They just signed a 30-day agreement with us, and that's the end of it. And it sounds like we will need to have them on board. They're agreeing and their understanding of what's ahead for them, particularly if our cost per employment is going to go up rather substantially. I would also like to know more about our revenue sources like concessions. I heard conflicting information about whether or not we could really count on having increased concession revenue in an airport in our location and our size, and given that people pass through here, they don't necessarily stop and buy stuff. But a lot of our information was based upon increasing concession revenue. I really want to know more about that, and maybe PFM can help us with that. And so those are the things. And most importantly, I really want to hear from Mike regarding his prospects for airline agreements going forward, because I don't want to see us scare the airlines away with a rather dramatic increase in cost per employment. And so that's kind of where I'm at. And I would make the request that PFM provide us at the next opportunity, maybe it's the next board meeting, what the cost impact, space impacts, and debt service requirements are for 70% increase over 1998 projections. That I'm done.
Thank you, Director. Director Leffel? You have your hand up.
Sorry, I was on mute. I actually would like to see Mike's presentation now so I can put it all into context, Gary, that I hear it all together so I can kind of analyze it myself and hear what it is rather than put it off and have it separated from what we heard.
Okay. That being said, I'm willing to do that if we take a quick 5-minute pause.
Thank you.
All right, let's take 5. Mike, over to you.
All right, thank you. Let me try to share my screen here quickly. There we go. Okay. Much of this has already been covered, so we can go through a good portion of this quickly, but I did want you to have an idea, just for a refresher, what we're talking about in terms of the overall program. You've seen this many times, but I wanted to share it with you. We do not have to go through it, but it's the phasing for the entire safety enhancement program. It's on the basis of this program that we've been working with FAA. This slide is designed really to show you the proposed timing for a terminal project. And you can see that those are highlighted. We would begin design of the terminal building sometime in the year 2022, perhaps a little later than that. And then construction would begin in 2025. These are some of the things that we've been talking to FAA about. FAA's original proposal to us was they would take care of the entirety of the safety enhancement program with the caveat that we find a way to independently pay for the construction of the new terminal building. They would support all of the infrastructure associated with the terminal building, including the taxiways, entrance roads, and eligible portions of the parking lot. We would be responsible for design construction of the terminal building. We could use PFCs and our CFCs to support our efforts. So they've committed that they would not require us to use our PFCs as our local share, but we would be required to have a local share of all of the projects, all of the project components. Initially, when we brought PFM on board, we met with FAA and they said, why don't you do a few scenarios for us, a little modeling? And they said, we'll contribute 20 million, 40 million, and 60 million to the overall program. And that's what PFM showed you in phase 1 of their work. Currently, FAA is indicating that they are comfortable with a programming total of $50 million. And this gets to Director Sabo's question about whether terminal buildings would be eligible. And what Brian and Mary said to you is correct. There are not many terminal buildings that are being funded by AIP right now as a simple replacement project. This, however, and the reason that we've always referred to it as a safety enhancement program is in totality, the program itself is viewed, and we have agreement with FAA that it will be viewed as a safety program. Therefore, they have told us that they are willing to allow us to use money from that set aside, that $50 million in the terminal program. We've covered this next slide very, very well. I think PFM did a great job of covering that, so we don't have to go through that. This is what we've been doing, and you've seen the product of the first, which is Kimley Horn's effort to evaluate terminal space needs. And that was really to do what it did today, and that was to show you that perhaps 100,000 square feet is too large for us. Maybe it's not what we need. We have 70,000 square feet now, but it is inefficiently orchestrated. We did have the opportunity to go to Payne Field in Seattle, and you'll see one of my recommendations going forward is that a small group of us do that same thing again. But they have about 45,000 square feet, and they're handling over 1 million passengers a year. So we wanted to try to find efficiencies in the building, which would then translate to efficiencies in cost. So that's why we brought Kimley Horn to bear, and I think Tom did a spectacular job of helping us through that. We have been working for the last 9 or 10 months with our congressional office to introduce a marker bill, which would be a vehicle that would eliminate the existing $20 million cap, which we just talked about. That marker bill is reported as of earlier this week, will be introduced next week. And it eliminates the cap of $20 million for AIP funding in terminal buildings at airports this size, as long as the project is a safety enhancement project. Ours clearly is that. It's very targeted language. What that language will do is give, and it's been fully vetted through the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, through the both sides of the aisle in the T&I staff and through appropriations. And everyone, it seems as though on a staff level, everyone is comfortable with the language that we've put forward. In fact, one of the conversations we had with T&I staff on both Democratic side and the Republican side is they didn't realize that there was still a cap in the language. So they have not pushed back at all about reducing that. The pushback we've really gotten is from FAA because they don't want to eliminate the cap completely, but they want to be targeted in how they would use it. We're also working to secure additional supplemental funds. There is another supplemental bill out there. When it hits, we don't know. FAA is going to be in charge of that again, as they were the last time. We're not quite sure when that's coming, but FAA is gearing up for it, so we anticipate it's coming fairly soon. We were pretty successful with the last supplemental bill in attracting $10 million, which we're now going to be using as part of the general aviation ramp development. We are working with FAA to program grant funding for further land acquisition for development opportunities. That gets to revenue generation, which is going to be key for us going forward. How do we generate revenues to support this effort? I think at the last board meeting, we showed you the relatively good success we've had with the Fenton and Keller property and generating revenue from that. We're looking to replicate that down the road as well. So we're working with FAA to program those funds, and that'll be part of our negotiations, which will start very shortly, which will continue very shortly. We're going to continue to discuss the private sector development opportunities with, and we have already had some, with private sector developers and their interest in P3. I don't think at this point I'm ready to say, unless the board is ready to say, go forward working toward an RFI. But I think further exploration is important. And I get to the point where in the next slide where I'll say we should go to Seattle to see that terminal building as well. And then the other component that we're working on is there's a $12.2 million marker in our capital improvements program for hangar replacement. That portion of the GA development is not eligible for federal funding. So we've removed that, and we've been doing our own internal analysis on what it would cost us and how we would finance a hangar development, refining the numbers. We also have our master tenant, Monterey Jet Center, doing the same thing. So we'll look at those two, we'll present to the board those two opportunities for further discussion and consideration. These are the next steps. By May, you'll have some recommendations about the analysis of the hangar projects. We are trying to get scheduled with FAA for a meeting next week, if not next week, the week after, to continue our formal negotiations. We're at a point where now we can begin those negotiations in earnest. And these negotiations are really to increase that $50 million set aside for us to something larger that will be more impactful. Answering the challenge that they gave us initially with an affirmative no, we cannot afford to take on the terminal building all by ourselves. We're going to need some help. So we'll continue those negotiations in earnest. Again, continuing the land acquisition efforts to improve to protect compatibility and revenue generation. We're going to look at all other opportunities to increase revenue. I think I've told some of you, and I think we've talked about it. We certainly talked about it at lease committee and reported that out, that we're looking at how we can take over the parking operation and generate net new revenue for us. The next one is the new airline lease agreements, and what I want to bring to you is a thorough review. And I would suggest that we will be hiring a consulting firm to assist us in our rate review and our lease development so that we generate maximum revenues without being overly impactful to our partners in the airline industry. And then wherever we can, promote new non-aeronautical development as appropriate. That's a little bit more difficult one at this point, but sometime in the future, I hope to be able to do some of that. Again, we're going to continue to work in Washington to eliminate the cap and to continue the exploration into TIFIA. We know the gentleman that is at FAA that's now trying to coordinate TIFIA for airports. He knows this airport well. He's been here. So we'll continue those discussions, or we'll reinvigorate those discussions going forward and see if there's any TIFIA opportunities that we could be a part of. And then finally, and I've hinted at it a couple of times, when it's possible, I think it would be appropriate for a contingent of the board to visit Payne Field, to take a look at that terminal building for two reasons. One, to look at the sizing and look at the layout. It is a very well done, efficiently constructed and laid out terminal facility that will handle a great deal of traffic, great deal more traffic than we envision here. The only hesitation there is the opportunity to travel given current conditions, but I'm hopeful maybe by May we can organize that site visit and some discussions with the developer that put that together. The short of that one is they ostensibly leased the property from the airport. They designed, constructed, manage, and handle all air service development opportunities. And they remit to the airport. They remit to the airport a rent, a ground rent. The airport still keeps PFCs and still keeps some of the landing fee revenues. There's a negotiation there that has to occur. Some of those revenues would obviously inure to the private developer to help make that model work. But I think it's a good model for us to look at as we continue to look at P3 and privatization opportunities. That's a quick rundown of the things that I see us doing. I would bring back to you at some point, probably not in March, but perhaps in April, a consultant to begin working with us on our airline lease agreements and our rates and charges review, with the idea that there is some movement there. And as I think you heard Brian say, it's not a bad strategy to begin that move now so that it's not overly impactful, or we minimize some of the impact once we get into the terminal project itself and begin the process of ensuring that our rates and charges remain as consistent and compatible as possible and competitive as possible as we go through this program. So that's the strategy I intend on moving forward with. And I guess, Mr. Chairman, that is a very brief version of my presentation.
Thank you, Mike. And we're going to go to the board now. Bill, why don't you first?
Okay, thanks, Mike, for that update. I have just two questions. In your opinion, I understood that you were going to hire a consultant regarding rates and charges, particularly to the airlines.
Correct.
In your opinion, having dealt with our airlines that are serving us now, do you think there's even a possibility that we get multi-year agreements with them for providing service, given that they would have to be told that the cost per employment would be increased?
I'm gonna approach this two ways, Bill. First, multi-year agreements are certainly a possibility, but at an airport this size in particular, you would be looking at a walkaway provision. The other alternative is to invite the airlines to the table and have them be participants in the entirety of this effort, and give them right of approval of your budget, not just your capital budget, but the entirety of your budget. Be willing to share non-aeronautical revenues to help offset some of the terminal costs associated with this. So you mitigate some of that increased cost. There's a lot of things that you would have to give up in order to get them to the table to make the kind of commitment that I think you're asking for. I think getting them to that point is probably unlikely at an airport this size.
Okay, thank you. That's fair. The other question I had is, and this is going to be difficult to answer, but given that the FAA has been a little reticent to commit to even providing us with a $20 million additional funding for the terminal, what is your consideration of actually getting more than $20 million, even if it's approved by Congress?
There's a couple of things. One, FAA has said to us as recently as last week, they don't have any problem participating in the components of the terminal building that they can participate in. And there's a process we'll have to go through to identify those. Their concern is they're comfortable at a $50 million set aside. They don't really care how we spend that $50 million on the entirety of the program. My message back to them is that's not going to be sufficient. And I've already told them that. So going forward, we start to negotiate moving that $50 million up to something more along the lines of what Brian showed you, which is in the neighborhood of 80 to 88, $90 million. One of the strategies behind the cap relief was to give FAA that comfort level that they could, in fact, give us more money. It gives them the ability to go back to Washington FAA and say, caps lifted, they need more money, which then could become the vehicle, or very possibly would be the vehicle that would allow Washington FAA to give the region more money, which then would inure to us. It's a weird strategy, but if we lift the cap, its intended impact at Washington FAA would be to say, there's a true need here. We need to find more money.
Okay, so I guess if they have already committed to $50 million and they don't care if we spend 20 or $30 million on the terminal, doesn't that take away from the other projects that we have identified in our master plan?
Absolutely, it would. That's why we need to move that $50 million more toward the $88 to $90 million range.
Okay. And when do you think you will know more about that particular process of negotiation?
I wish there were a specific timeline I could share with you. This is going to be a process. Because of the way FAA is funded, they'll begin now in earnest programming money for next year and the year after and the year after and the year after. So we'll begin these discussions. If we're successful, and this would be an early success, they would begin moving that $50 million in their programming schedule up closer to where we need it to be next fiscal year.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Sure.
Director Miller. Director Miller, you have your hand up?
Trying to unmute here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. You said there was something you'd heard today that gave you pause and want to change your presentation. What was that?
Yeah, I think it was more along the lines of a change in focus on the P3 opportunities. I think I intuited fairly clearly that there's some real issues that we would be faced if we decided to move in that direction. So my initial thought was going to be, let's begin the RFI process. I want to step back from that, as I just said, and look more seriously at that component. What do we think the hazards and the roadblocks are for us in the community, and how do we address those, or are they addressable? And that's something that we can do with PFM and clearly with the board's input.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any of the directors have any questions? Mike, I did have one question. What is the square footage of the Painfield terminal?
45,000.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting terminal. And even if the board decides not to go down the road toward privatization, I think it's the kind of terminal you should look at from a layout and component standpoint. So I think there's a dual function here.
Yeah, and I'm just going to make a comment as one director. I think your instinct on the vibe on the P3s is absolutely correct.
Mhm.
I, as one director, have some very, very serious concerns about being involved in that type of an arrangement, and we can get into it more later. But I think that you're making the right decision when you say let's slow it down and take a good look at it. So I think that's the right course of action. Director Leffel.
Just a comment, since I've just traveled, there's nobody on a plane going anywhere. So to take an Alaska flight out of our airport directly up to Seattle, I will tell you, is not very risky, and I'm willing to do it at any time. There were 33 people on my 117 passenger plane, and my friends told me there were 18 on their 777 coming out of Seattle. So there's nobody traveling. It's actually a good, safe time to go.
It's easier for Director Leffel, Director Miller, and myself to say we're ready and willing to go, because by May, all of us will have had our second vaccination. So
I'm hoping that we get a jab out here pretty soon too. That's my hope.
I do as well. Okay, Mr. Dawson, anything you want to add before we put this to bed?
Thank you, no. Thank you, no. It's been a pleasure to be with you. And I did have a donut. Thanks
for spending the day with us. All right. No, Director Miller, now we got hands again. Director Miller, do you still have another question?
If my hand's up, it shouldn't be.
Okay.
All right, Director Sabo.
Yes, I wanted to address, before we adjourn, I wanted to address two things. One, I had requested that we give consideration as a board for direction to both Kimley Horn and then maybe a PFM regarding a lower projection of passengers going out for the past maybe for the next 10 years. Right now we're at 150% of 1998 figures. I would like to see something, and I understand the impact of only an 80% increase, so that we understand the financial implications of that. And I would like the board to consider that guidance to staff and to the consultants. And the second thing is I'd like to be able to know how I can access a recording of this fire hose. There was a lot of good information, and I'm really interested in being able to review the information that PFM provided.
Director, I can answer the second question. It will be up on YouTube, and we'll make sure to get a link.
Okay, good.
And I think you can link it to our website, but I'll confirm that.
Okay, thank you.
I see no other hands at this time.
Did you, Mr. Chairman, did you understand my request regarding additional guidance for the staff and for the consultants?
I did. Do you feel there's further action necessary? I'm sure that Director Lapierre heard it as well.
Well, I didn't hear anybody, I didn't hear your head nod or anybody's head nod, so.
I got it. We'll take care of it, Bill.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, seeing no other hands or questions, I'll call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
You have a second?
Second.
I'm sure all are in favor, so. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
And thanks to all of our fine consultants for the time they spent with us today. Thanks very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
You're welcome.
Happy to.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.